Disdainful Stroke to keep these decks off of their big plays as well. So the reactive cards that David is playing definitely informed by the Abzan and Sultai Reanimator decks. I think a mixture of Disdainful Stroke and Anger of the Gods makes a lot of sense right now. And Glenn Jones on the left here playing Public Enemy #1 right now, the Abzan Reanimator list.
And we're underway. Both players trading off some tri-lands at the beginning of the game, so here's some setup. David is on the play, and it looks like Glenn's going to start by trying for a 2-drop here. And it's going to be Satyr Wayfinder.
So I'm really excited to watch David's deck in action. I'm not sure if we did a deck tech with him yet, but I would imagine if not, that one is coming down the pipeline shortly.
Yeah, what you should know about it is it's a mix, about half creatures, half spells. The creatures are efficient, so you have Savage Knuckleblade and Pelucranos to match up with Courser and Sylvan Caryatid. And then the spells are a bunch of 2s and 3s. It's a mix between red removal and blue counter spells.
And Glenn here, I feel like we've seen this a lot on camera today, missing with his Wayfinder trigger.
And it's never really seemed to slow down the Abzan decks is the thing. They miss on it, and that's usually okay.
It means you're putting 4 spells in the graveyard, and if you hit one big creature, it's probably not the end of the world, but early on, that could be a big miss.
Well, we'll see if it catches up to him. That's for sure. David, draw on turn 3, see if he gets one of his threats out, whether it's a Courser of Krufix or a Savage Knuckleblade here. And it will be neither, just a Wooded Foothills and a pass. Looking in his hand, he has a pair of Lightning Strikes, a fair number of lands here, Pelucranos, and a blue spell.
I believe Stubborn Denial, most likely the card in there. Dig Through Time also in the deck.
Well, we'll get a look at it. Glenn Jones is going to cast Thoughtseize. And it's Disdainful Stroke, Pelucranos, Lightning Strike, Lightning Strike.
And David immediately says, I know you're not taking a Lightning Strike out of this hand, so it's between the Stroke and the Pelucranos.
Yeah, taking the Pelucranos is actually pretty strong here, as it leaves David with a totally reactive hand in a matchup where I'm not sure David can just play control. He can't just sit back and answer things. I think he'll eventually lose that fight.
Well, keep in mind, Glenn might not know exactly what he's up against right now. I'm sure these two have talked to some extent because they're friends, but he may not know exactly the mixture in David's deck. Part of the risk here with playing a purely reactive game on Glenn's side, taking the one threat card, is that David has Dig Through Time in his deck. So if you just sit there and play this very slow game, and David finds one of his copies of Dig Through Time, that can be a game-ending play.
Yeah, Glenn opts to try to force through one of his own spells. He's going to take Disdainful Stroke. It's kind of suggesting that he has maybe a Siege Rhino or something like that of his own.
Or possibly just an answer to the Pelucranos. Glenn with 2 main deck copies of Hero's Downfall and 4 Murderous Cuts. So he does have a healthy amount of removal for one big threat.
Satyr Wayfinder swings in here. We'll see. Going back to McDarby, does have an opening for Pelucranos. Can't have high expectations that it will stick around. Just Glenn let him have the card.
Exactly. When your black opponent says, keep a 5/5, probably means they can kill a 5/5.
See what McDarby goes from here. 4th land. His draw was a Temple for the turn. Looks like he's not going to make the Pelucranos, though, instead opting to hold up Lightning Strikes.
And I think at this point he just senses what's going on Glenn's side of the table, doesn't just want to run his creature in there, have it get killed for very little upside.
Well, Glenn's going to play a second Satyr Wayfinder. This one sees a bunch of lands as Glenn opts to keep, takes a Temple and immediately plays it. Now, when a player does that, just like reveals it and immediately plays the Temple, does that tell you it's their only land?
Not necessarily. The scry land there is the best thing for Glenn to hit because nothing else is going on that turn. So maybe he's got nothing, but there's no guarantee.
Yeah, it's not a guarantee. There's some body language going on to it. I don't know. Maybe that's reading too much into it.
No, there's definitely pieces of information to be picked up there. There's also the risk of reading too much into that because I don't think it means 100% that Glenn has no other follow-up.
Yeah. 2 more points of damage here from Glenn as the Satyr Wayfinders continue to deal damage. David played a Temple there and just passed back the turn again, so still opting not to play that Pelucranos.
Well, I think he wants to be able to do it when he's got some sort of follow-up. Keep in mind that he's got 3 copies of Stubborn Denial in his deck, so it's easy for him to set up a situation where he plays Polukranos if he draws a Stubborn Denial, can fight over the 1 removal spell, and then maybe Polukranos does a lot of work.
We see a Siege Rhino here from Glenn. And no play on end step there for David. Just wondering whether he would double Lightning Strike it.
Well, I think because he's drawn an Anger of the Gods, more likely if he wants to do that, he'll Lightning Strike the Siege Rhino and then Anger of the Gods away everything.
Absolutely, and that's exactly what he does here. So that will exile all of Glenn's creatures. And one thing that is important to notice, he did draw Stubborn Denial that turn, so when he makes the Polukranos, he will have counterspell backup for it. Glenn just plays a Bear Doomwake Giant there, just as a 4/6. Maybe this is the window McDarby needs.
This feels like a good spot.
Draw was Sylvan Caryatid for the turn. And here it is, Polukranos World Eater. 3 cards remaining in David's hand, one of which is Stubborn Denial. On Glenn's side, he's going to go ahead and cast Murderous Cut at the Polukranos. Should, I imagine, get the Stubborn Denial out of McDarby's hand.
Yeah, it's very hard for David to use this Stubborn Denial on much else, so
Now,
has to protect his Polukranos.
Glenn does have a second cut here. May see that one happen. And there's not a second counterspell nor a second blue mana for McDarby, so Glenn knows that one would work if he wants it. And that's exactly what he's going to do. He'll try it again. This one takes care of Polukranos. And Doomwake will knock McDarby down to 7, so Glenn Jones still ahead. And McDarby not having the best of draws here. It's been a pair of Sylvan Caryatids, which he'll now cast.
Yeah, David desperately needs a dig through time. That's where this has got to start, I think.
Well, it seems like there's a lot of 1-for-1 trading here, but at the end of the day, the Abzan Reanimator deck has better threats than the Teamer deck. So if they just 1-for-1 trade, David will find that his creatures will be outclassed. Courser of Krufix for Glenn. Nets him a free card off that Windswept Heath. Satyr Wayfinder on top of the deck, but he does have a free shuffle if he wants something else.
It is the challenge of playing a deck that is a mixture of threats and answers, and each type of card is slotted very specifically into its role, is that you're very sensitive drawing the right mixture in all the matchups. That's the nice thing about cards like Doomwake Giant and like Hornet Queen. They can play double duty. They can be attackers when you need attackers, and they can also control the board when that's what you're in the market for.
Yeah.
And that diversity means you're much less at risk of just drawing the wrong half of your deck. That's what happens, basically what happened to David here. He drew a lot of reactive stuff, but never put Glenn under any pressure.
Mm-hmm. 2 Lightning Strikes take care of the Doomwake Giant. Glenn has a second Doomwake, that sweeps David's board. And I think that really is one of the difficulties of a deck like Teamer. So you have a card like Stubborn Denial, which is really good, but it is a counter spell that wants you to have a 4-power creature. So that's 2 different pulls on your deck. You want to be reactive, but you also want to have these large creatures.
And when you have the right mixture of everything, this can be really good. But
right.
When you only draw one half of your deck, you're going to be less efficient than the more robust decks of the format. And Glenn's showing that right now.
David needed pressure here, and he drew Sylvan Caryatids. Things like that can happen. And it looks like Glenn preparing to close out the game here. He's got David down to what looks like 1. Glenn at 21 has a Whip and Hornet Queen in his hand, but he'll take the conservative route. Just play Satyr Wayfinder. There was a Reclamation Sage on top. He'll get a land. Mill some Downfalls, Murderous Cuts. Shows a Siege Rhino on top. And I don't believe there's life gain in David's deck, so...
Well, he's got to be able to beat the board and beat the top of the deck, and that's asking a lot.
Yeah. So game 1 goes over to Glenn.
David there with just too many lightning strikes is the easiest summary of that game.
So when you have a deck that's both aggressive and controlling, like a Teamer deck, post-board, I almost feel like you want to have the option to turn into one or the other. And in this matchup, it seems like he needs to lean on his blue cards because if he's playing the proactive game plan, Glenn's stuff is bigger and more efficient.
I like the counter spells a lot in this matchup. The Disdainful Strokes, to a lesser degree, the Teamer Charms, I think can do some good work here. David in the sideboard with 2 copies of Xenagos the Reveler, 2 Burn Away, 2 Scour the Sands, 2 Back to Nature, a Lightning Strike, 2 Negate, 2 Disdainful Stroke, Storic Dragon Claw, and a 3rd copy of Dig Through Time. So I like bringing in the extra Disdainful Strokes because there's a lot of quality 4-mana cards in Glenn's list. I think the 2 copies of Back to Nature are also reasonable. Even if you're only getting a 1-for-1 out of it, that's probably still fine. And there's going to be some spots where he gets much more than that. Past that point, I'm not sure if there's really anything too attractive here.
Yeah, well, I mean, I agree with that. I think his Lightning Strikes were not particularly strong there. He was 2-for-1ing himself a lot with them. I like more copies of Dig Through Time in this matchup. I think he really could have used one in any of those games. And the more he goes on a control plan, the more I'd want to see him use them. Even a card like Surrak Dragonclaw might be fine here. It's pretty big. It's good against Doomwake Giants. And it's reasonable, I think, to have here.
The problem is that it's really bad against Death Touch threats. So
it is.
I don't know. With Hornet Queen, some of these decks have Farika in the sideboard. Might be a little risky, but...
Yeah. Well, to deal with Hornet Queen, if you're David, you're going to have to Teamer Charm it, Disdainful Stroke it, or have an Anger of the Gods. Those are really just your answers to it. So if those are your answers, I guess I'm not sure that Hornet Queen needs to, that you can compare Surrak to Hornet Queen then.
Right, yeah. If you're already priced into having one of those good answers to it anyway, then maybe Surrak's fine. On the other side of the table, 3 Drown in Sorrow, 3 Glare of Heresy, Anissa Worldwaker, and 2 copies of Anafenza, 2 Reclamation Sages, a Bioblight, Soul of Idistrad, a Farika God Affliction, and a Thoughtseize. I'm not too excited by anything that's going on in Glenn's sideboard here. I think the Farika is pretty solid. Past that, I mean, the 1 Nissa I think is fine, but I would not sideboard too heavy here. I think Glenn's 60 offers a lot more than his 15 does.
Yeah, Thoughtseize is great against blue decks. If he suspects David's going to be more controlling, maybe he ups the count on that guy. But you're right, his main deck's pretty good here. It's just big.
Would not change very much.
Yeah, these players are getting ready for their game. One thing we talked about earlier was the Cardboard Crack. This is the popular online comics now available in paperback form. You can find this and learn more about it, starcitygames.com/cardboardcrack. There are 3 full volumes. Each of one is on sale for $12.99 right now.
You are likely familiar with this comic strip if you subscribe to the Star City Games newsletter where a comic appears, or if you're just aware of, Magic, social media in general, where this comic appears all over the place. Again, 3 books, all available on sale right now, $12.99 a piece. Get them for yourself. Great holiday gift. StarCityGames.com/cardboardcrack for more information.
And yeah, so the game 1 is good for Glenn, but this seems to me like this is going to get closer for our post-board games.
I think David brings a lot more to the table than Glenn does. But there's still the issue of, does David draw the right balance of types of cards in his deck? Because he's, as I mentioned before, his cards are much more siloed than Glenn's are. They are for specific roles. And so drawing the wrong mixture of that stuff can be really bad, even if he has the right lands and spells ratio, which he did that game. I mean, he had stuff to do. He had reactive cards. He had a couple threats, but the mixture was just not there.
Yeah, and that is, and this is interesting. So I like the color combination a lot. And I was trying to think before about just this kind of strategy, right, where you are both playing like a Pelucrano style card and playing a Disdainful Stroke style card in the same deck. And I can't think of too many recent examples of decks that do this, but it certainly is interesting. I like the kind of strategy it's going for.
For sure, and it speaks a lot to, how many powerful reactive cards there are in the format that fulfill specific roles. Because you can really custom your reaction to the decks that exist in the format. Anger plus Disdainful Stroke, not something you see in a lot of game 1s, but David feels right now, where the metagame's at, it's the right mixture to have.
Yeah. Well, David's on the play, starts with a fetch land. Glenn has a temple, so we're to the setup. It's interesting to me. So when I think of a teamer deck, I think, okay, would this deck want Heir of the Wilds? That's kind of a teamer card, or is it a teamer card? It's really hard to say. David's chosen not to play it. It's only 2-drop is Sylvan Caryatid.
I think that his threat base is trying to maximize Anger of the Gods. So the only thing that dies to it is Sylvan Caryatid, which you can't really cut from this kind of deck, and everything else survives.
Yeah, David, in his hand, does have his one sideboarded copy of Burn Away. This is a card I only really have experience with in Limited, but it actually serves to be pretty decent against Abzan. It's a 5-mana spell that kills Siege Rhino and then exiles the graveyard.
It's expensive, but when the stars align the right way, it's going to be awesome. And that's a card we've seen a little uptick in popularity. We see more of them floating around in sideboards than we used to. One copy here, one copy there. But I don't think it's a card anyone initially thought had any constructive legs, but the graveyard matters a lot as a resource right now.
Well, especially the teamer colors do not have a good way to hate on the graveyard right now. It's turn 2, Sylvan Caryatid for Glenn. David finds his blue source. Gonna go for Courser of Krufix here, though. Showing a Savage Knuckleblade on top of the deck.
That's pretty solid. The last game we saw, David just didn't have enough stuff to do, enough proactive things. So
yeah,
having a Knuckleblade could be really good here.
Yeah, I believe it's his second one. He has one in his hand as well. That whole cycle, right? Savage Knuckleblade, Siege Rhino, and Butcher of the Horde, all really, and Mantis Rider even, really tournament level cards. It's neat to see each wedge playing their own version of the card.
Yeah, they all have high ceilings and high floors.
Yeah.
A good recipe for constructed level play.
And then there's the fifth one of the cycle, Karu Lichlord. That one sees a ton of play.
Still waiting.
Still waiting. As soon as he gets played, then the whole cycle will make its way to tournaments.
David now contemplating this turn. I think part of it is he has the option to shuffle away with Wood of Foothills right now. So does he want to have that second Savage Knuckleblade?
That's a third Savage Knuckleblade.
Oh yes,
he drew the second
yes.
one. Yeah. How many 4/4s for 3? Like, this is the tension, right? Are you a deck that's mashing 4/4s for 3, which is definitely a strategy, or are you playing a control game? Because the second or third Savage Knuckleblade is more or less a vanilla 4/4.
Well, there's still 4/4 hasters.
There's still 4/4 hasters. You're right. But the other ability is you can only pay for so many Savage Knuckleblades.
Exactly. Well, I think his hand basically allows. His hand is what it is.
Yeah.
So he kind of has to go down this road.
Yeah, I mean, it's like if you want to shuffle away the Knuckleblade or whether he just wants to keep drawing them. It's going to be a Thought Seize from Glenn. He'll see Burn Away, Stormbreath Dragon, Savage Knuckleblade, and Land 5.
We got a reader.
Yeah. Burn Away, 5-mana instant. It deals 6 damage to target creature. When that creature dies this turn, exile all cards from its controller's graveyard.
A sweet one of. And as I said, a card that's picking up a little bit of steam. I've started seeing one of this card scattered around a variety of, Teamer and Mardu, Jeskai lists.
It is good. It's a way they can fight Whip. And it doesn't fight it permanently, but it buys time.
I know from my experiences playing the limited format, if this hits you at the right time and you're not expecting it, it's lights out.
That card can be really mean.
Not a great hand to Thoughtseize here from Glenn because there's not really a hole to attack in this hand, and Glenn's life total is going to be under attack pretty soon.
Deciding to pick which one he wants here. Can he beat Savage Knuckleblades? A lot of times your best way to defeat a Savage Knuckleblade is to just play bigger things. If you play a Hornet Queen, then you can just not really care about Savage Knuckleblade.
Well, Hornet Queen's a great answer, but even some of the bigger creatures aren't that great because of the +2/+2 power.
Right, Siege Rhino is not an answer.
Not helpful right now. Now, Glenn's got a lot of Murderous Cuts in his hand, so there's probably a way for him to weather the storm here.
And he went with one of the Savage Knuckleblades, even knowing David's drawing another one. Decides especially if he has these Murderous Cuts, Stormbreath Dragon's got to be the least of his concerns.
Yeah.
And Burn Away, while good, if Glenn doesn't have Whip in his hand, okay, it's a 5-mana kill spell. That's fine. And he will murderously cut the Savage Knuckleblade down. Disdainful Stroke on top of David's deck now. So play Wooded Wooded Foothills. Interesting choice here for David. If he wants to play Storm Breath, he'll have to shuffle away the Disdainful Stroke.
He also has the option of, I guess, casting the Knuckle Blade this turn and then drawing the Disdainful Stroke next turn.
Right.
But I'm not sure if David even wants to draw that card at this point. I think that he wants to keep the pressure going.
If he could draw it right now, I think him playing Savage Knuckleblade and then leaving a Disdainful Stroke up would be great, but he can't. He's like a turn behind. He'd really like it in his hand right now. I don't know if he wants to draw it.
I feel the same way.
And Savage Knuckleblade Haste. He's going to go ahead and... Well, we'll see whether or not he draws it.
He always has the option of shuffling away before he draws.
Maybe it's how this play turns out. Because I think if Glenn just kills the Savage Knuckleblade, I don't know if I really like having Disdainful Stroke in my hand anymore.
Exactly. And David's going to have a lot of information on Glenn's draws because of the Courser, so he can reevaluate whether or not he wants that Disdainful Stroke.
Yeah, Glenn has Hero's Downfall waiting. That's a card that cannot be Disdainful Stroked. See Glenn putting a Murderous Cut to the front of his hand. And that's going to cut down the Knuckleblade. And I think this will cause David to shuffle his deck because he knows Glenn has the Storm Breath covered as well.
Yeah.
And this Disdainful Stroke's left without a target at the moment.
I agree with you. I feel like this stroke needs to be shuffled away.
Well, now that of course I said that, I'll throw the other argument out. This game looks like it's headed toward a top deck war, right? They're both almost out of cards. If that's going to happen, the card that will beat Glenn is a lights out Hornet, or that'll beat David is a Hornet Queen. So maybe you want the Disdainful Stroke in case a Hornet Queen or something like that shows up.
I guess it's just hard to commit the Storm Breath Dragon to the table now.
Oh, absolutely. You have to wait to 7 mana, I think. And even then, it's not going to work, but yeah. I can't imagine he wants a second Disdainful Stroke. Well, I guess if he's really settling in for a long control game, maybe he does want a second Disdainful Stroke.
If you felt like the first one's good, it's reasonable the second one is going to be good too.
There aren't many threats that cost less than 4 mana that David has to care about. And now he's got to be happy he has one. Glenn's next card is a Hornet Queen. And we're going to get into a staring match. Neither player was going to want to tap out for their own threats. I suppose if David's the player with Dig Through Times in his deck, well, sure, let's do it.
That's definitely a way to sculpt this.
David gets a free card off Shivan Reef and another Disdainful Stroke on top of his deck. Let's draw them all. I think, right? Are there ways that Glenn can win with cards that cost 3 or less, or are these just all hard count? Is David just drawing dissolves here?
This might just be too much for Glenn to get through.
Right, these are hard counters for all the cards that matter. Glenn draws Hornet Queen. This has a forest on top. Could cash it. Could get it for free. He will. And I want to say some heads up play on David. I think we were both at first a little skeptical of this line, but this doesn't seem half bad, really.
No, it does not.
Mill for 4 there. Glenn finds a Temple. And gets a Siege Rhino on top. That'll get... So far, Glenn has 2 threats that need to be disdainfully stroked. He'll pass back. David draws a 3rd copy of Disdainful Stroke. And then another Storm Breath Dragon, so...
And this I might also be looking to shuffle away here, too.
Maybe.
Against the Hero's Downfall.
What about the...
Maybe he can just try to weather the storm, I guess.
Yeah, maybe he needs to have another Storm Breath for the... You know, his first Storm Breath's going to die to down... He waits till he has 7 mana. Then he plays a Storm Breath with Disdainful Stroke up. He lets it get Disdainful. He lets the guy get Downfall. Now he's going to play second Storm Breath.
Right.
And if David didn't crack a fetch land main phase, that means he intends to draw the card. Because otherwise he'd want to crack the fetch land main phase to try to hit a land off the top. And Glenn...
At some point, Glenn needs to sort of slog through these Disdainful Strokes as well.
Yeah, he's going to go for, it looks like Siege Rhino here. Now, I want to throw something where I might want to hang on to the Siege Rhino because if David's plan is to play Storm Breath with Disdainful Stroke up, one way to stop that plan is to amass 2 Siege Rhinos in your hand.
Yeah.
And then David would need 9 mana to make that play. So I think if I wanted to run a counter spell into the Disdainful Stroke or run a card into it, I might want to run the Hornet Queen into it.
Well, the flip side of it is I don't think Glenn wants to take the 4 points of damage from the Storm Breath. So I think he wants to leave up Hero's Downfall the whole way through.
And he would need 10 mana to do that with Hornet Queen, and he only has 9 right now. Draw for David. Sylvan Caryatid now on the top. He has Stroke. No, he has 2 dragons, 2 Disdainful Strokes.
And the Burn Away.
And
I think Glenn might be contemplating using Hero's Downfall on the Courser because that prevents David from getting an opportunity to find land number 7 here.
Yeah. This is right now there's a fetch. The fetch trigger is on the stack. That does make him significantly more vulnerable to Storm Breath Dragon if he gets rid of his downfall. He's going to do it.
Well, the thing is, David still can't pull the trigger on the Storm Breath this turn because that opens up Glenn to be able to resolve the Hornet Queen.
Yeah, and what this does to Glenn is it means he's going to be the only player with a Courser of Crewfix in play, which means if we keep playing this stare at each other style game, Glenn will start to pull ahead.
Yes.
His draws will just be better.
Now, David always has the option here of just using Burn Away on the Courser and getting back to parity and waiting for land number 7. I do not like casting the Stormbreath Dragon here.
I don't think you can let Glenn have a Hornet Queen.
Yeah.
Unless David had an Anger of the Gods in his hand.
Exactly.
I don't think he can do that. He can just pass and then end step Burn Away the Courser.
Exactly. That's the play that I like.
If you're Glenn, then, do you throw cards into Disdainful Strokes to try to stop him from burn awaying you?
No, I mean, I think the Hornet Queen's too good to just throw into a Disdainful Stroke.
Sure. Courser's really good here, too, though. And there's a whip on top. That's another must counter. So
Well, it may not be a must counter.
yes, he has Burn Away.
With the Burn Away, it may not matter very much.
It depends whether David has brought in Back to Natures. If he hasn't, he does not have a way to get a whip off the table. And that was the end step Burn Away on Courser. Draw from McDarby. Not the land.
Yeah, still waiting. It was a second Burn Away.
This is a really, I like how this game's played out so far. This is really interesting.
David has definitely set up a line of play. He knows what he's trying to do.
Now he finally hits land 7, and it's time for Storm Breath Dragon. It's going to swing for 4. Glenn goes down to 10. Siege Rhino, the draw for Glenn. He may have, depending on how much mana he has here, he may get to resolve the Siege Rhino. If he has 11 mana, David would let Siege Rhino resolve.
I count
11.
I'm counting 10.
Is it 10?
I count eight
10.
lands.
Oh, that's a Wayfinder. You're right. It's only 10.
Yeah, I count. Now, this is a pretty good test spell because
Whip. Swings for 1.
it's likely to resolve and does a little bit of something. And if David does counter it, that's great too.
Yeah, because now it's in the graveyard.
Yeah.
Now, of note here, if Glenn goes for Hornet Queen, David will have to burn away something to stop the Hornet Queen from getting whipped back. Like now Glenn's happy to throw Hornet Queen into the whip,
Yeah.
into the counter spell. And actually, if you go back before, once Glenn saw the whip on top of his deck, there's an argument for running the Hornet Queen into the counter spell right then and there, because it makes the whip way more threatening.
Yeah, no, there is some argument for that.
I don't know. There's a lot. This game's really interesting.
Yeah, there's definitely a ton of decisions back and forth, and because the Coursers were in play on both sides of the table for so long, both players are working with a ton of information.
Yeah. Swing for with Storm Breath again puts Glenn down to 7. David does have enough mana to use the Monstrosity ability on Storm Breath. He has in hand, we know of, a Disdainful Stroke, a Burn Away, and a second Storm Breath. If Glenn doesn't have the spot removal spell, then this is pretty... Then the Storm Breath should win the game here. Like, David can Disdainful Stroke the Hornet Queen, because he knows Glenn's only card is Hornet Queen. He can Disdainful Stroke it. If Glenn tries to whip it back, he can burn away something. And then David should be able to untap and swing 2 Storm Breaths for lethal.
Yeah, David has a lot of control because of the second burn away.
Yeah, and that's 8 points. I think this works out for David, barring a good draw from Glenn.
The whip does not work for this turn. The Hornet Queen can't get into play.
Right.
And that's all that Glenn has going on right now.
So if Glenn has 11 mana, right now he has 10, then he can threaten to cast Hornet Queen and whip it back the same turn.
But the second copy of Burn Away is the lock there.
And that's what Glenn doesn't know about. So like if Glenn draws the land, I think he'll try for that line because it's really good.
Yeah, it's attractive. And it's hard to put your opponent on the second Burn Away.
It's hard to put them on the first Burn Away.
Yeah.
That's the kind of card that I'd be like, when my opponent would play it, I'd say, hey, that's a really neat one of. And then I would be foolishly mistaken. Once I play the second one, then I start wondering, how many of this card are they playing? All bets are off.
Exactly. And this is the line of play. I think he's going for the Wayfinder here to try to juice up the whip a little bit to give him some more options. So I think the way that Glenn is navigating this turn, there's no way that he's going to be able to stop the Burn Away from crushing him.
Yeah, so he does whip. He's going to try to whip back the Anafenza or the Siege Rhino. I think it's Siege Rhino. And here's where Dave's going to burn away a Satyr Wayfinder in response.
And you can see Glenn going, oh, the second one, like, this was not anticipated.
And Glenn knows about the second Storm Breath, so we are on to game 3.
Both copies of Burn Away critical there and allowing David to get game number 2.
You know, I was at first skeptical. You said some players are bringing this in to fight against whip decks. I was thinking, okay, I know that this Graveyard Exile ability is good, but this is a 5-mana creature kill spell, and it doesn't even kill everything. It kills most things, but this card can't possibly be that good. It's really clunky, and I was proven wrong that game.
Well, whip is set you behind tempo-wise. You're planning on catching it all up once you connect with something, get one big threat out of your graveyard, whatever the case may be. So even though Burn Away is slow, so is Whip of Erebos.
Right.
And you can tell in the spots where the person's not predicting that that's going to happen. It's not just the one turn, it's several turns of development that gets set back on top of losing most likely your biggest creature in play.
I mean, when you think about it, there's so much pressure on these 5-mana spells in this Teamer style deck. Like, you know, you could be playing another Storm Breath Dragon, you could be playing a Sarkhan. It's a hard sell to convince me to play a Burn Away in that spot instead, but I'm getting sold here.
Exactly. No, it was very impressive, that game. That's for sure. Both of them played a huge role. And he can't get Whip off the table, but maybe you don't have to if you can just kill one of their big threats and nuke their whole graveyard incidentally.
So David McDarby evening up the game. And I just want to give tip a hat to playing that one, especially keeping all the Disdainful Strokes on a turn where it really seemed like that wasn't the direction he wanted to go.
My instinct there at that sort of spot of the game was Glenn's draw steps are so much better than David's. You got to capitalize on your early pressure that you got in with these Knuckle Blades. But David correctly assessed that those Disdainful Strokes prevent Glenn from resolving anything of substance. Everything good in his deck is 4+ mana in that spot.
Well, what's tricky about this Teamer deck is you're constantly reevaluating your role. Are you an aggro deck? Are you a control deck? There's a lot of decks, just I guess in Magic in general, where you kind of lock in your role at the beginning of a game, and sometimes it changes, but you know, when you're playing a Jeskai tempo deck, I guess before Jeskai aggro, like pre-board, game 1 Jeskai aggro, you're the aggro deck almost every matchup.
Exactly. There's some weird, mono red style outliers where you're the control deck, but by and large, you're always beating down.
Right, and but with David, it's not even, at least with Jeskai aggro, you can say, this is the matchup, I'm this role. But with David, it's not just this is the matchup, it's this is the board state, this is the turn. That keeping that Disdainful Stroke, that's asking, what role am I right now? Am I the control deck? Am I the aggro deck? And I think David he nailed it that turn.
Yeah, that was great assessment. My instincts were...
I thought he was the aggro deck that turn, but he was not.
My instincts were off. David took a much better line than I suggested. And those Disdainful Strokes were great. Glenn could never work his way out of them.
They are, I mean, I think it's the realization that they are hard counters in this matchup. They counter everything that matters.
Yeah, going through the list, the only cards that are a potential impact that you can't disable stroke are Hero's Downfall and Courser Crewfix. Everything else of substance is caught up by that card.
And I think Courser Crewfix of those two is really the prize of the two.
Yes.
It seems like, and I'm interested to see this play out, David is playing a protect the queen style strategy where he's going to be a control deck, and then he'll wait until he has a Storm Breath or a Savage Knuckleblade or a Pelucranos, and then he'll wait until he has 8 mana and then play it with a bunch of protection up.
And as long as he can prevent Glenn from getting anything too significant on the table, that's a great recipe.
Yeah, it really worked out last game. You see Glenn on the play, turn 1 Elvish Mystic. That is a card that is in some of the builds, not all. Glenn has decided to play a one of them this weekend. I was going to say 4, but nope. All right.
Just the 1.
He's going to commune with the gods.
And that's pretty much perfect because you want 1 in the opening hand and then not draw 1 for the rest of the game. Ergo, you play 1.
There's no, right.
Simple.
He communed with the gods into a Siege Rhino. He's going to play a Temple to fix his mana then. Good start for Glenn. Has mana accelerate. He's going to have a turn 3 Siege Rhino on the play. And in a really great hand.
Now, David can break it up. He has a Crater's Claws in his hand, so he can kill the Elvish Mystic next turn. Wouldn't surprise me if he did it, because his deck does not have a lot going on turn 2, besides his own Caryatid.
One thing I like what Glenn's done in this matchup is he's moved to a more of an aggressive role, actually. He's boarded in cards like Anafenza the Foremost, which play really well against Anger of the Gods style decks.
I would have assumed that Anafenza was for, the mirror match kind of stuff for the second part of that text box, but just 4/4s are pretty sweet against Anger of the Gods and Lightning Strikes.
Well, as we've seen, the mirror match is about whips because this is a reanimate. I mean, when it was old Obzon midrange, I liked that in the mirror, but if it's Obzon reanimator, maybe that's not even there anymore, you know? David with a pretty tight play there. He Crater's Claws the Elvish Mystic, I think because he knew he couldn't really do much about the Siege Rhino there. And now he has to choose between Courser Crewfix and Sylvan Caryatid. The Siege Rhino will resolve. That's the bad news if you're a McDarby fan. He does not have a disdainful stroke.
Yeah, David there with the option. I like playing the Temple and the Caryatid. It's much more efficient because you want to play your Courser before you make your little land drop. So playing your third land in a Courser is not that efficient. Much better to get the Caryatid into play.
And a huge opening for David. Glenn did not have the land into Siege Rhino. He missed the land drop, so he was forced to just cast Anafenza that turn. David will try to pull ahead. Courser of Crewfix into a Shivan Reef. He's going to have more than one Courser. If Glenn can make another creature, Anafenza can start going to work, putting counters on things, but as of right now, he still doesn't have the land for the Siege Rhino. And that's just a vanilla 4/4 then.
And this is, part of the issue with David's deck in the matchup here is this role assessment / narrowness of reactive cards. The Stubborn Denial is a tough card to get to resolve on something on time, and to be able to fulfill the Ferocious requirement is not the easiest thing for David to do.
Yeah. Now, this is an interesting play, and I wanted to talk about this. Glenn had the option there to make Siege Rhino, swing, put a counter on it, and instead just opted to cast Pharika.
Well, I think next turn, it just sets him up better down the line for establishing Devotion. I also think that the Anafenza has a tapped clause, so he can't play the Siege Rhino before combat and swing in.
Okay, so it doesn't get the counter.
Right.
It's just so there's a big priority placed on this guy resolving to not play Siege Rhino there.
Yeah, it's tapped creature, so you need to have another attacker.
Okay. Now but it's interesting. Playing a non-Devotion Pharika at that point in the game wouldn't be like the obvious play to me here.
No, I don't think so either, but David's not really pressuring him, and Glenn's going to be able to fulfill the Devotion requirement for this Pharika most likely for the rest of the game, so it puts a lot of pressure on David to react to everything, probably leave up mana inefficiently.
Yeah, David does not have an answer to Pharika. He does have a burn away for the Anafenza.
And David going ahead and doing this straight away, so no opportunity for Farika there to make any tokens. Get the Elvish Mystic out of the graveyard.
And now we'll come Siege Rhino. Stomping onto the battlefield, taking 3 life. And these cards are just brutally efficient in their numbers. 4/4 for 3, 4/5 trample with really good ability for 4.
David's setting up a nice little board, though. I mean, he's drawing a dig through time, and if he starts finding lands off this Courser, he may be able to weather the storm here.
Back to Nature on top of his deck. Glenn doing a little thumbs up. Card often good against his deck, not good against this board. There is, however, a Whip of Erebos in Glenn's hand, so it may be live at some point. Interesting, though, David does have a Courser, so maybe not. He can play second Courser Caryatid, but then he's playing 2 Coursers into a Back to Nature, which he has to draw.
You can also just cast, I believe his hand has 2 Coursers in it. Or sorry, 2 Caryatids rather, or?
He could just make 2 Sylvan Caryatids.
His hand is a little unwieldy right now. The fact that he's not finding lands off of the Courser is really stunning his development.
If he makes the Caryatids, then at the very least he'll have mana to dig through time if he needs to do that. But maybe he just doesn't have... I suppose if he plays Caryatids, he'll take 4 off Rhino, and he may not ever have time to just tap out some guys and play a dig through time. He'll be pretty far behind at that point. He's going to go with second Courser, second Caryatid.
A little awkward, as you mentioned, but...
That dig, yeah, that Back to Nature is...
I think he has to do it, though.
Just means you don't draw a card next turn. You just get this Back to Nature. The selling point for me, actually, is I really want to gain 2 life every time I make a land drop. That seems really nice, and I would love to do it. Whip of Erebos to play for Glenn. He's fine playing that into a Back to Nature. That's Devotion 6 for Farika.
Yeah, this is pretty safe. David's played into the Back of Nature here, so if you lose it, not the end of the world.
Glenn's just getting a lot of things on the table that are difficult to deal with.
Just different angles of attack. There's a lot of weird stuff going on the side of the table, and David does not have the most streamlined answers to what's going on.
Yeah, he is contemplating upkeep casting this dig through time. It would take all his mana and his whole graveyard, but that means he doesn't have to draw Back to Nature. Decides that's not worth it. Flips, it's another dig through time. Maybe it was a play he needed to make. Don't think he's happy about that draw. Or that reveal, rather.
David might be in a spot soon where he's just going to have to chump block with the Coursers, and then the Back to Nature is sort of turned back on.
Yeah, he's going to end up digging through time anyway. Now, does he get to see the top card of his deck during the resolution of this spell?
I do not believe so.
Okay.
The same thing with Wayfinder.
Oh, yeah. Yes.
It's the same deal.
A lot of options here. Pelucranos, Courser, Blue-Green Temple, Negate, Storm Breath. None of these seem to answer the board, really, though. Last cards are Another Dig and a Frontier Bivouac.
The Farika here is going to be really problematic if David cannot answer what's going on the board. This is a 5/5 Death Toucher. He can't kill it. And so to interact with this card, he's going to have to interact with the Devotion count. And I'm not sure he's able to do that either.
He set up a really good shop here, but Glenn has done a great job of playing threats that his deck is not well positioned to deal with.
It's the attack from Glenn has been multidimensional. He's not just jamming on one axis here. He's got a threat in play. The Farika threatens more damage, which makes David have to play a little bit more conservatively. And then the Whip of Erebos is a whole other thing going on.
And I think this is what, to me, is so strong about the Abzan deck. If you try to play a control, even against in the face of something like a control deck, which is what David has turned into, is that, yes, they can counter all your things, and counter spells are good against you. However, if they miss countering something, the one card can just beat them.
Yep. So it looks like David has settled on Stormbreath Dragon plus Negate. Now keep in mind, it is not the most known mode on Stormbreath Dragon, not the sexiest mode, but it can just play defense against Siege Rhino. And David has a Stubborn Denial in his hand that checks one removal spell out of Glenn.
Right.
So this might be a path towards stabilization.
I'm guessing that we're going to see a chump block here, though I'm really loath to see a chump block if I don't really want a chump block if I'm David. I really like that lands would gain me. I like that lands gain me too.
I don't think David's going to chump. I think he's going to just take the hit.
See if maybe Glenn can make that even less appealing. He's going for something pre-combat.
Yeah, I believe this is a Hornet Queen, and that's going to turn on the Devotion for Farika.
Yeah, it certainly is something to activate the Farika. But Hornet Queen, and this is just it. David's behind here, so he can't afford to leave up counter spells for anything. He's really getting bullied by Glenn just playing more and more threats.
Yep.
And Hornet Queen would certainly be difficult for David. That gets around that Storm Breath play you were talking about. And you're absolutely right. Here is Hornet Queen. That's more than enough devotion. Glenn gets insects into play. Swing for, I believe, 9. And David will chump. I think after he sees the Hornet Queen, maybe, I think the odds change here.
I think so too.
He's gonna fetch it here. He probably wanted to fetch before the Courser died.
Yeah, small thing. It would have. He would have picked up a life. Might matter. But I think he has to chump now too, because part of his game plan for stabilizing, I have to imagine, is the Bat nature. So he might as well chump block now, because he's going to lose the Courser whenever he pulls the trigger on that card anyway.
Sure. I do like how the Courser lets him somewhat control his draws here. So he's going to need pretty specific draws. Surrak Dragonclaw, the draw there. And there's a Temple on top. He's got to see a lot of cards. The question is whether or not he really just has cards in his deck that can deal with this. Even if he gets, if he got to draw 12 cards, would it matter? Can he answer this in a timely fashion?
Well, Surrak gives him, I feel like he's got a path now. Because Surrak does a pretty good job of locking up the ground. If he finds Anger of the Gods, that checks the Hornet Queen. And now things are tenuously stable.
He has to find Anger of the Gods immediately, however.
He's got one more turn.
But his draw is Disdainful Stroke. So how does he find it?
Well, I think he still has another dig.
He did not
take
it.
He did not take the dig, that's right.
You're right that I think Surrak into Anger might do it.
It's a path. I think he might have to. I don't know if we're still with the Scry on the stack. David is still mulling this over. Looks like he's giving it up. And it's possible the Anger's got sided out if that's the case.
Okay. Yeah, if he doesn't have Anger, then he doesn't have a way to get back in there. Which Anger's a hard card to board in this matchup. You're both playing the same number of Caryatids. It's really, you're just trying to hit Hornet Queens with it.
And exiling as well is nice. But David, I guess, with no answer left in his deck, he can't be the Hornet Queen. And Glenn Jones is going to be able to win 2 games to 1.
Yeah, great match here between the two. Yeah, Glenn will move up to 5-0, and it's confirmed. Yeah, David mentioning in their comments here that he did not have Anger of the Gods left in his deck.
I could see leaving in 1 or 2. I don't think it has to be a 4 or a 0 thing.
I don't want to draw it, but I want to be able to find it.
Exactly, and especially if he's going up to the 3rd copy of Dig Through Time, then I think there's a really loud argument for having 1 copy of Anger in your deck.
Yes.
Because you don't want to draw a bunch of them, but it's something you wouldn't mind drawing some percentage of the time, and it's definitely a nice option to find through Dig. Because if David has an Anger in that top 7 when he digs, I think he's got a shot. He's still, swimming upstream. He's behind, but it's not impossible for him to get out of it.
Yeah, so Glenn Jones moves to 5-0, and it just seems right now, Abzan Reanimator kind of defeating all comers.